Two soldiers came in and put my hands behind my back, and they put a mask over my face. And the commander said, "Confess that you're a spy or we'll kill you." And every time I would say that I was a photographer or a journalist, they would punch me in the face.
It's a very taxing, dangerous, lonely profession to be in. It's also a profession that seems to have an almost addictive quality to it.
I think to be a great combat photographer, foremost, you really do need nerves of steel. I mean, you need a kind of craziness that allows you to, by choice and by an act of will, repeatedly walk into the maw of the beast.
Where we writers cower in a ditch when the shooting starts, they've got to go over the top and get closer to the action.
I don't know that a photograph ever corrected the wrongs of the world, but that's not going to stop people from trying.
Can I make it back alive? Can I tell the tale? Can I bring that goddamn roll of film out?
Ron Haviv is a freelance photographer based in New York. He is one of only 15 or so young photographers covering the major story of our time, the breakup of the post-Berlin Wall world.
My first experience in covering international news as a photojournalist was in Panama in 1989. The dictator Noriega was saying that he was going to step down if he lost the election. After he learned that he lost, he declared that the election was null and void, and that the actual victors were not victors and were in fact traitors. The army came out and started beating people up and tear gassing people. From up a small hill came 30, 40 paramilitary guys who were named the Dignity Battalion, and all of a sudden hell broke loose. The vice presidential candidate was covered in blood, and he had been knifed in the arm, and his bodyguard had been killed lying on top of him. All of a sudden, one of these paramilitary guys comes running with a long iron pipe and starts to beat him with it. And I just stood there and I took photographs, and still there were bullets flying around, and it didn't mean anything to me. I was just so intent on taking the photographs. And the photographs were immediately transmitted and were published all over the world. The following week, I had the cover of all 3 U.S. magazines, Newsweek, Time, and U.S. News. Something I think has only been done a few times. The same photographers had all the same covers. It was also my first experience in realizing truly the power of the press. When George Bush announced the invasion of Panama, he used those photographs as a justification for, or one of the justifications for, the actual invasion.
You remember those horrible pictures of newly elected Vice President Ford, covered head to toe with blood, beaten mercilessly by so-called dignity battalions.
I was 22 at the time when I took those photographs. So it was a good beginning for me, a good way to start off my career.
He had the hunger, he had the drive, he had the talent, he wanted to succeed. He had a vision, and I basically helped him and guide him to his vision and help him succeed with his vision.
Haiti is a remarkable place. The people are really amazing, the energy level, the colors, there's something quite unique about Haiti. I first arrived in Haiti in 1990 to cover the election of President Jean-Bertrand Aristide, who was going to be the first popular president elected directly by the people. And I continued to cover it through different events over the last 5 years, including the eventual overthrow of Aristide. The people that were in power found that the best way to control the populace from uprising was a very calculated and determined way of frightening people. Every morning you could drive around Port-au-Prince, the capital of Haiti, and you would find somebody shot in the head, somebody with their hands tied behind their back, killed by machete. By the time the Americans came, the Haitian people, who are generally very optimistic and positive people on a whole, were so downtrodden, and all they wanted was this man that they loved, this person that they had elected with an almost 90% majority, to come back. And they had felt that there was no way that it could happen. The Haitian reaction to the U.S. soldiers is, it's been quite interesting. I've done several different operations with the U.S. military, starting with Panama in 1989, and it was quite similar to Panama and quite similar to the Gulf. The people were enthralled. They were thrilled. They couldn't believe it. They were so happy to see Americans. America was their savior. They were just beyond themselves with happiness because they knew that their president would then come back, that the Americans would bring him back.
The Soviet Union is no more. The republics have declared their independence. In Moscow, the capital of the Russian Republic, Boris Yeltsin has dissolved the parliament, which has blocked all reform. Inside the parliament building, communists have stockpiled huge amounts of weapons. Civil war is imminent.
Yeltsin's forces had surrounded the White House and kept the communist forces inside. There was a large communist demonstration that took to the streets. So this march of thousands of people decided to go liberate their brothers in the White House. And broke through many, many different lines. There was fighting between the protesters and policemen and army, and people were basically just being murdered on the street by hand, by pipe, when they were throwing people off of bridges. And eventually they broke through to the White House, and Yeltsin's people all disappeared. And these guys thought that they were about to take over the city. Anarchy started to reign in the streets of Moscow. There were army units driving around who nobody knew what side they were on. There's a story of the commander of the armed forces in Moscow who was driving around in his car, and he saw all these units driving. And he didn't know whose orders they were following. He didn't know if they were loyal to him or if they were loyal to the communists. And as night started to fall, the communist protesters decided to take over the television station. And unfortunately, a number of journalists were wounded and several were killed because the Russians were firing from above, and they were just firing on everything that was down. After the first day of anarchy, nobody believed that Yeltsin would attack the White House with tanks. But that's exactly what he did the next day. I was with the Russian troops, and I photographed the frontline soldiers attacking the White House. I had spent quite a lot of time inside the White House with the communists, and I had listened to them and listened to their venom and their rhetoric. And these people weren't pure communists, like good for the people. These people were really vindictive, and most of them were really mean and anti-Semitic and abusive and anti-American and anti-this and anti-that. I was quite happy when they were defeated, because I thought that if they had taken power in Russia, the world would take a major step backwards. One of the reasons that Yugoslavia got so little attention in the beginning was that it was so complicated that it wasn't easy to just say, these are the bad guys, these are the good guys. Look how simple it is. Because there's so many names and different people fighting for different reasons.
Since the death of Marshal Tito in 1980 and the dissolution of communism, the increasingly nationalistic Serbian Republic threatens the ethnically mixed states of Slovenia and Croatia. In the winter of 1991, civil war begins. The town of Vukovar in eastern Croatia is besieged by the Serbian army.
What's happened over the last 4 years since 1991 in the war in the former Yugoslavia is that access is becoming strictly controlled by whatever side that you're working with. And this was no different with the Croatians, where they were strictly controlling the access of journalists to the battle zones. I went in with the Serbian army, with their permission, to work and document what they were calling the liberation of this town. Every building in Vukovar had been destroyed. Thousands of people who had been living in basements and underground tunnels were finally coming up in the sun because they didn't have to be afraid about being shelled anymore. Their army had been defeated, and most of the army had fled. People that were left were these old women and young kids and families. People that hadn't been able to get out of Vukovar during the 3 months. Many people have been executed in the streets. I saw many bodies lying on the ground. There was quite a lot of brutality and human atrocities in Vukovar committed by the Serbs. Some of which I was able to photograph, and some of which I wasn't able to photograph. Two of the strongest images for me that survive are pictures that I wasn't able to take. An elderly Serb woman said something to a soldier and pointed to a man, and the soldier walked up to the man and just shot him dead right there. And then a few minutes later, another man came stumbling out of a house and was killed immediately in the doorway. Well, the majority of journalists died in the early part of the war. Since it was a war in Europe, a lot of people sort of just drove down from Vienna or drove over from Italy and were not very experienced in war photography or war journalism. People didn't realize how dangerous it was. So in the Croatian War, there were no armored cars. Very few people were wearing even bulletproof vests or helmets. So a lot of people were killed by being in the wrong situation at the wrong time and not being prepared for it. In March of 1992, I was working in the former Yugoslavia, and my assignment at the time was to photograph Russian peacekeeping troops who were going to occupy part of the land that Croatia had lost during their war. And what was happening at that point was that tension levels were rising in Bosnia, but there was no fighting. And one day I was driving around and we got a message that there was some fighting in a town across the Serbian border in Bosnia, about a 5-minute drive over a bridge. So we decided to go look at what's happening, and the town had been split in half already. The Serbs were on one side and the Muslims were on the other side. And the townspeople were fighting against each other. It was, you know, the baker was firing on the butcher and the butcher was firing on the baker. Then all of a sudden, several busloads of soldiers appeared. And these were from a militia unit named the Tigers. And they're led by a man named Arkan. They immediately went into the mosque and they took down the Islamic flag and hung up a Serbian flag instead. As they were doing that, there was some commotion outside in the house across the street. And when I went outside, some people were being pulled out of the house. This one boy was terrified and ran away and ran into the courtyard of the mosque and disappeared. He came running around the corner again, and then someone just shot him in the back. They brought out another man, an older man. Then a woman came out following him and she started screaming. And then all of a sudden there was a burst of gunfire and he was shot in the chest several times. And he was lying there dying, and this woman came up to him and she put her hand in his hand and put a hand on his chest, trying to stop the bleeding. She was screaming. And then a few seconds later, more gunshots, and then she was killed. This was later became the term of ethnic cleansing, because this was the Serbian method of fighting, in which they would take these towns, they would kill people, and then they would hope to frighten the rest of the population into leaving. Instead of having to kill the whole town, they would kill a number of people, make sure that everybody knew these people were killed, and that they were killed because they were Muslims, and hope that the rest of the town would leave.
Amid rising fears of civil war, the people of Sarajevo march for peace.
And there was thousands and thousands of people in the streets, all holding up old Yugoslav flags or pictures of Tito, which represented to them the unification of Yugoslavia, a federation of Muslims, Serbs, and Croats, a time where everybody lived in peace. They started to march past the Holiday Inn, which had become the temporary headquarters for the Serbian political party in Bosnia. And all of a sudden, from nowhere, snipers opened up onto the crowd. The snipers were actually firing from the hotel. Here's people marching for peace, and they're attacked by snipers. They're unarmed. Eventually, some special police unit from Sarajevo stormed the hotel, captured the gunmen, and arrested them. And for a brief moment, the Sarajevo people thought, with the capture of these 4 or 5 gunmen, that all would be fine, and there were celebrations and people were very happy. And little did they realize what was going to happen over the next 3 years. Over the last 3 years, I've made numerous trips to Sarajevo to cover the plight of the people there. People living under a microscope where a sniper can see you wherever you go and can decide at will when to fire to kill a child going shopping or a mother washing her laundry. Countless civilians were killed by indiscriminate shelling, not done on military targets whatsoever. The war, basically, the way it was being fought in Bosnia, was a war to destroy the morale of the people.
In Bosnia, the goal of the Bosnian Serbs was much less to defeat the Bosnian government forces in battle. Had that been the goal, they would have made a serious attempt to take the city of Sarajevo, which would have put an end to the war had they succeeded. Rather, they simply wanted in order to create this ethnically homogeneous Great Serbia, to drive Muslims out of the territories the Serbs wanted to annex. I saw a child fall in the middle of the road, and a tank, quite intentionally, ran over it. And the soldiers laughed. They didn't care. They thought they could do what they pleased. What the ethnic cleansing and the Great Serb Project is emblematic of is the new kind of fascism, which is ethnic fascism. The entire historic record of Balkan Islam, at least in Bosnia, is being destroyed.
When these camps were discovered, there was a huge outcry. And this is a comment on the way the media works in the world and the way that the audiences work in the world. I think the Serbs realized, okay, we've been found out, we have these camps. Let's let everybody see what exactly is happening here. It'll be a really big story for 1 or 2 weeks. Then the world will become saturated and they won't want to know about the camps. They just figured, just let everybody go to the camps, let them see what they want to see. After a while, nobody's going to care. They were smart in that they realized that the appetite of the world would be quite limited and that people would be tired of it quite quickly. In September and October of 1995, the Bosnian government went on a large offensive in the northwest of the country. It was their most successful offensive in the entire war. They were attacking areas which they had lost in early 1992. The Serbs had allegedly killed many of the inhabitants of villages. Some of the soldiers that were fighting were actually survivors from those villages. So as the Bosnians would take village by village, they would also be looking for evidence of these war crimes. Soldiers would find the remains of their families. They would find their homes burned and destroyed. One soldier who was a survivor of a village where all 69 people were killed found that the entire village had been buried in his backyard.
I think the Europeans decided that the slaughter of the Bosnian Muslims was something that simply had to be tolerated because anything else would be too costly, by which they meant too costly to themselves.
Warring sides have realized the power of the press, and everybody now makes a serious attempt in their ability to control the images that are going out into the world.
They suddenly have access to your material and guns. So it's not that they're going to write a letter to the editor and say that they're so irritated by your coverage. I mean, they may seek you out and shoot you.
From the Serb commander Arkan, he was threatened that he's going to drink his blood. If ever Ron showed up in Serbia again, consider him dead.
What I say about out-of-control small paramilitary groups, it was like a warlord declaring some sort of sentence on Ron. I personally would never have gone back to the Eastern Hemisphere for the rest of my life.
Well, Arkan's one of the many little monsters that the war in the former Yugoslavia has thrown out. He was a gangster in Yugoslav times.
He was supposedly a bank robber who was convicted and escaped from jail in Sweden. He's alleged to have been an assassin for Tito.
He returned to Serbia, as far as I know, for good in the mid-'80s from Western Europe after he got out of jail. And Arkan was a sort of hit man, this time not for the Yugoslav secret police, but for the project of ethnic cleansing.
These photographs here were taken by a photographer who says it's an atrocity.
No, I will tell you now. First of all, you see, this picture is very clear. The photographer which made this picture, he's a friend of mine. You understand? I let him show those photographs to the world. First, this lady was shot by the Muslim sniper.
It's not what the photographer says. We also hear that another man running away was shot in the back by these men.
That's not true.
And that somebody else...
That's not true.
Somebody else was marched off into a nearby building and thrown out of a second-floor window.
That's a lie, a pure lie.
The Serbs really after that didn't allow or very much tried to control photographers working with them. And it was very difficult to photograph actual ethnic cleansing or actual battles, especially for a Western photographer. People realize now, and this is especially true with television, that if they take CNN, Sky News, BBC to the front line in the morning, by that afternoon, the photographs will be, the images, TV images will be all over the world. In the Gulf War, they instituted what was known as a pool system.
Pool is a representative of the weekly news magazines, a representative of monthly magazines, a representative of the wire services, a representative of major newspapers, and representatives of the networks. And they are allowed very controlled access by the military to the battlefield and to war zones in general. They then have to share the material that they gather with all of the other accredited news organizations. What, of course, you get is a very sanitized view of what war is about.
So as a freelance photographer, if you didn't have an association or an assignment with the magazine, you were unable to work legally within the confines of the system.
The rationale from the military, and it's not a rationale which is without some degree of merit, is that because you can do things like sat phoning from the hotel balcony, you can get images not only back to your agency, but you can also get images to the enemy, which have a high degree of information which is useful to them. The pool system has developed as a direct result of, I think, of the Pentagon's experience during the Vietnam War, and the realization that a too free a press can really set you back if you're in the military.
There is just nothing like a picture of an American boy with half his face shot away to give you pause to ask the question in the morning when you're taking a look at that image, is it worth it? Is the government doing the right thing? Should I be sending my own 18-year-old boy over there or my own 18-year-old daughter over there to take part in this exercise? Are we doing the right thing? And that's why the government would love to get a handle in this country, legally, on our writers and photographers and direct the kinds of things that they can gather, the kinds of information and images that they can bring home.
The next story was, would Saddam Hussein stay in power or would he fall? There was a Shiite rebellion happening, and there was a possibility that Iraq would really be ripped apart. So myself and a number of other journalists said, let's go there, that's where the next story is, let's see what happens. And we drove in convoy to attempt to reach the Shiite Muslims, and instead of making a left where we should have made a left, we drove straight, and we drove straight into the Republican Guard, who were at that point retreating from Kuwait and on their way to attacking the Shiites. outside of this town called Basra. We were taken at gunpoint. Everything was taken from us. We were robbed. All the equipment, the cars, the telephone, sat phones, cameras, food, everything. And at that point, they were capturing more and more journalists who were getting caught in different places. In the end, we were finally flown to Baghdad, and there was probably over 40 journalists from all different nationalities that had been captured together. And it was about 6 days that we were held, and finally released. Supposedly, we became part of the final ceasefire agreement.
At the end of the Gulf War, both the Shiites in the south and the Kurds in the north were in open rebellion against Saddam Hussein. The Allies left Saddam Hussein in power and deserted the Shiites and Kurds to the Iraqi armies. A moral and humanitarian disaster began to unfold.
When I went to southern Turkey to cover the flight of the Kurds from the Iraqis, such a huge number of people to be on the move with all their belongings. It was breathtaking to see the Kurds themselves as incredibly resilient and strong people, carrying refrigerators on their backs and carrying their children. The mountains that they crossed in the middle of some of the coldest weather. It was quite incredible to see what people would do to keep themselves and their families alive. That was my first experience with such a huge group of refugees and things of that nature, and I thought, this is the worst thing that I could possibly ever see. Several years later, I went to Somalia for the famine.
Famine photography is almost war photography because one of the features in many wars, particularly many civil wars in Africa in recent years, has been the way that control of the food supply has been a weapon of war that people have used to move populations, to intimidate populations.
Somalia was just incredible, that people were dying on the streets, and every morning a truck would drive around and pick up bodies, and the truck would always be full by the afternoon. I think in Somalia, the famine there was really hard to deal with because this famine was largely man-made, and that it was due to the greed of a number of warlords and people hungry for power and money that were keeping food from being distributed. And I then thought, this is the worst thing I've ever seen. I can't believe how people are treated and how they have to live and how these people have to die. And then several years later, I went to Rwanda and covered the exodus of the refugees into Zaire from Rwanda. This was a scene out of the Bible. It was biblical.
I didn't know so many people could die so fast. I don't just mean in the course of a couple of weeks. In Goma in Zaire, you would go down a road, say, at 10 in the morning, and there would be 500 people along the side of the road. And you'd come back at 10:30, and 200 of them would be dead.
The Hutus, who had executed so many Tutsis and then eventually lost power in their country, were stricken with cholera, and so many of them died from this disease. It just automatically brought down the imagery of the hand of God.
So here's this very densely populated country and very small country, where you would drive 3 kilometers and there would be a church with 400 dead bodies in it. And then you drive another 3 kilometers and there'd be another church with 500 dead bodies in it.
I see the pictures. I've been to a couple of bad places, but I've never been anywhere, anything like that. I see the pictures. People like Ron, men and women like Ron and his colleagues, they actually go there. And I don't think any of them had seen anything like Rwanda. I think Rwanda, they came back, there was nothing they could say, basically. There were no tales of camaraderie and foolhardiness and bravery and the kind of thing that gets you through covering a war in a conventional sense.
And in the end, I realized that what happened in Kurdistan was hell, what happened in Somalia was the same. You can't compare disasters with each other. And that I think that this is something that is affecting the world as they become saturated with all of these problems. It's what's been known as donor fatigue. Everybody says, well, the Kurds aren't as bad as the Somalis, or the Somalis aren't as bad as the Rwandans, or vice versa, then I'm not going to help these people, I'm not going to give money to these people. The world community thinks often that they can do things through a massive show of strength that needs something more subtle. I think that when the Americans went into Somalia, I think that was fantastic. And no question in my mind, they saved many, many thousands of lives. The fact that they tried to take it beyond that was the problem. I don't think they took into consideration all the problems that existed in that country.
Photography attracts a certain kind of individual who has a kind of a zeal to correct the wrongs of the world. Anger at injustice is a very strong motivating force which drives photographers to do what they do and to take the kind of risks that they take.
I've seen people die in front of me, whether by execution or people have just sort of died from starvation or disease. Perhaps with starvation and disease, at that point there's not much you can do as a human being, but when people are executed in front of you, it's often, you have these questions. Could I have prevented it? Could I have done something? Why wasn't I able to help this person? And everybody makes their own decisions on when it's viable to interfere and that your interference will actually be able to save these people, or would just put your own life in danger to the point where you'll also be killed. Myself and other journalists have saved the lives of people. In Somalia, picked up people in villages and brought them to hospitals. In Haiti, we've saved people from being killed by police. In Yugoslavia, we've dressed the wounds of soldiers that were wounded next to us. We put the cameras down and lives have been saved. I really always try to travel with somebody else, and specifically for the reasons that I need to travel with somebody that I know and trust in case I'm wounded. This person will forget about the photographs and make sure that I will be taken care of. So there's a small group of us that travel from place to place, and we usually work together. You also need to work with somebody that you know is experienced. You stop at a checkpoint and there's some drunk person or somebody acting really stupid or somebody that doesn't like you and wants to instigate something, that you need people that you know that are not going to get nervous, not going to make a stupid mistake, not going to do something that gets you killed. You always have to give respect to somebody with a gun.
It's a very physically demanding job. It's not the sort of job that you're going to want to be doing in your 50s and 60s.
There's very few people over the age of 35 doing war photography. You can probably count them on one hand. I think it's because when you start out, everything is so new. And the first time you get a bullet fired at you, until you see a dead body, it doesn't really click together. I think that everybody has a certain point where you reach your limit and you say, well, that's enough, I can't do it anymore, I have to move on. Where my personal cutoff point is, I don't know. I mean, I don't think it's going to happen for a while.
This is what I mostly hoped would never ever happen to him. We were so afraid because he was threatened after that picture was taken. And here he is caught by some Serbs, and God knows if they know Arkan or they're part of Arkan.
It was dark, it was getting very cold, it was winter. And we were thrown into a woodshed, still handcuffed together, getting more nervous by the minute. We were brought into command headquarters. They came in and they unhandcuffed us together, and the other photographer, they took him out of the room and they put a mask over my face. They started this interrogation procedure. Are you a spy? What is my mission? And then a few minutes later, I heard a gunshot, and the commander said to me, oh, we've just killed your friend. You have 2 hours to confess that you're a spy or we'll kill you. All I could say was, no, I'm just a journalist and I'm a photographer. And then probably early morning, they brought me out again, put me up against a wall, and then drenched me with cold water again. And then a few minutes later, I heard my colleague screaming from the cold water. So then it was like 100%. It was okay, The feeling of luck is something that I think that I need to continue to do the work, and I think that other people do. Several times during the war, I would spend weeks on weeks and weeks and numerous occasions where there would be really close calls. And then it would reach a point where you think, well, my luck's run out for this trip, it's time to go, I can't take it anymore. And then when you feel that, you just pack your bags and you head for the nearest airport and you go. And I think everybody has had that experience that has covered war. Once you come back from these situations, it's very difficult to re-emerge into a normal working society. It's something that everybody struggles with because these are where your conflicts arise with your friends that you left behind, or your boyfriends or girlfriends or husbands or wives. The first week or so is always very intense coming back from these situations.
I think we have all had the experience of finding home very pale, that for people to complain about their childhoods or their material situations, or even to gossip, I must say, about the world, seems very hard to take in once you've been in places like Rwanda and Bosnia. And then you become a misfit in your own society.
One of the things that I've noticed about a lot of photographers, and particularly the photographers who worked in Vietnam, is that many of them have exhibited the same kind of post-traumatic stress syndrome that a lot of veterans have exhibited after Vietnam, which of course is not surprising because they were under exactly the same kind of stress and the same kind of trauma that those people who were firing guns instead of cameras were. But it's very, very hard to adjust to, you know, quote-unquote normal life after you've been in a war situation.
And then the fact of being a war correspondent is you go do it again. I mean, you choose to return again and again to these moments, and that's a very specific choice. And it, in some ways, I think it becomes a harder choice the more that you do it, because it's impossible at some point not to just look at the magnitude of how horrible it is that people kill people.
You do worry about it in the back of your head, you know, you get to like the person as a person, and you worry about his safety, and so it's always a worry when he goes out to cover something.
They're getting something out of it, and they're not getting whatever that is anywhere else. And they have to go back, and they have to go back, and they have to go back, and they have to go back. It's a search. Obviously, they're looking for something. They're searching for something. And they're going to keep going back until one of two things happens. Either they're going to find it, or they're going to get killed. Then the search is over. And there are just men like that, and there are just women like that.
I think I've been extremely lucky on so many numerous occasions. I basically can't even count them anymore. I would spend weeks on weeks and weeks where there would be really close calls. Shells or bullets are so close, yet so far, because I've been lucky enough not to have been wounded, while a number of my colleagues have been wounded, or unfortunately some have even been killed. The one theme that I've come out with is that the same thing is happening in each country over and over again. The names are different, the faces are different, but the reasons are the same. The ideas are the same. We hate them, they hate us. We want that land, we want that. I find it really frustrating and sad. My anger really turns more into acceptance of that's the way the world is. All I can do is try in my small way to show people that it's still happening and hope that it can change.
Drive, he had the talent, he wanted to succeed. He had a vision, and I basically helped him and guide him to his vision and help him succeed with his vision. Haiti is a remarkable place.
The people are really amazing, the energy level, the colors, there's something quite unique about Haiti. I first arrived in Haiti in 1990 to cover the election of President Jean-Bertrand Aristide, who was going to be the first popular president elected directly by the people. And I continued to cover it through different events over the last 5 years, including the eventual overthrow of Aristide. The people that were in power found that the best way to control the populace were published all over the world. The following week, I had the cover of all 3 U.S. magazines, Newsweek, Time, and U.S. News. Something I think has only been done a few times. The same photographers had all the same covers. It was also my first experience in realizing truly the power of the press. When George Bush announced the invasion of Panama, he used those photographs as a justification for, or one of the justifications for, the actual invasion.
You remember those horrible pictures of newly elected Vice President Ford, covered head to toe with blood, beaten mercilessly by so-called dignity battalions.
I was 22 at the time when I took those photographs. So it was a good beginning for me, a good way to start off my career.
He had the hunger, he had
that he lost, he declared that the election was null and void, and that the actual victors were not victors and were in fact traitors. The army came out and started beating people up and tear gassing people. From up a small hill came 30, 40 paramilitary guys who were named the Dignity Battalion, and all of a sudden hell broke loose. The vice presidential candidate was covered in blood, and he had been knifed in the arm, and his bodyguard had been killed lying on top of him. All of a sudden, one of these paramilitary guys comes running with a long iron pipe and starts to beat him with it. And I just stood there and I took photographs, and still there were bullets flying around, and it didn't mean anything to me. I was just so intent on taking the photographs. And the photographs were immediately transmitted. And
writers cower in a ditch when the shooting starts. They've got to go over the top and get closer to the action.
I don't know that a photograph ever corrected the wrongs of the world, but that's not going to stop people from trying.
Can I make it back alive? Can I tell the tale? Can I bring that goddamn roll of film out?
Ron Haviv is a freelance photographer based in New York. He is one of only 15 or so young photographers covering the major story of our time, the breakup of the post-Berlin Wall world.
my first experience in covering international news as a photojournalist was in Panama in 1989. The dictator Noriega was saying that he was going to step down if he lost the election. After he learned, two soldiers came in and put my hands behind my back and they put a mask over my face. And the commander said, "Confess that you're a spy or we'll kill you." And every time I would say that I was a photographer or a journalist, they would punch me in the face.
It's a very taxing, dangerous, lonely profession to be in. It's also a profession that seems to have an almost addictive quality to it.
I think to be a great combat photographer, foremost, you really do need nerves of steel. I mean, you need a kind of craziness that allows you to, by choice and by an act of will, repeatedly walk into the maw of the beast.
Where we